Hi, this week we are looking at content analysis, chapter 7 from your text. Content analysis involves a number of things. It can look at a collection and analysis of almost any type of textual, visual, or audiovisual material. TV shows, movies, commercials, song lyrics, music videos, speeches, letters, emails, tweets, books, posters, magazine articles. What it involves is you bring together and analyze materials that already exist in some form generally, rather than creating something new, such as a survey or an interview that uses you to collect new data. What it gets you is a better understanding of some aspects of the norms, beliefs, or discourse of a particular culture and subculture as expressed in those audiovisual, textual, or visual materials. What it allows you to do is learn more about that culture or subculture based on those words and images that people use, sometimes in private communication, sometimes for public consumption in the general media. One thing to note is people may not even consciously notice the subtle cultural messages embedded in all these materials around them. And that's partly what a sociologist does, is bring out those more subtle messages through this analysis. One of the reasons content analysis is often a useful tool is because you're not creating the data, it can be a more inexpensive form of research, although also sometimes very time intensive. One part of content analysis is quantitative content analysis. That can involve counting how many times various patterns appear in words or images being analyzed. You can use counts to identify the images and words that occur more frequently. That can tell you something about the norms and meaning of what you are tracking by the things that are seen most often or heard most often are often those that are seen as most important. You can also examine the relationships between different variables to understand how cultural ideas are related to one another. For example, if you are looking at the sexualization of women in advertising, you can see how that correlates with the relationships between men and women portrayed when that sexualization occurs. This kind of methodology around quantitative analysis tends to be deductive and positivist, testing hypotheses using statistical analysis based on the frequency and relationships detected. For qualitative content analysis, you have a different approach. You're often thinking to identify particular themes based on what you see. You may identify the words and images used in order to convey a theme or message, to understand what the meaning seems to be of all of the images portrayed. You may start by investigating a general topic, look at the materials involved, and see what themes arise as you look at the data. This is a more inductive approach and more of an exploratory investigation of a topic to see what themes arise as you look at the data. Now, this kind of methodology should seem more like the semi-structured interviews that we've studied, with a more interpretivist approach, with consistent questions for materials, but being open to new themes emerging. Content analysis research often combines both quantitative and qualitative approaches in different stages of the research, often using a more qualitative approach to identify the themes worth looking at and coding for, and then developing more structured quantitative analysis to see whether those themes exist and are strong throughout all the materials examined. Now, when you do content analysis, there's often a critical methodology, meaning the questions asked are often critical of the norms and ideas that are already being discussed in society or expressed, but often aren't seen day to day. Often when you do content analysis, you're pointing out the content of materials that a reader may not have realized was there, that may be there to fool, manipulate, or in some way indoctrinate the audience into those norms. The goal is to question often those cultural norms, belief, and discourse. And in presenting all of this information, the data generally samples broadly amongst materials in society, but when you present it, you're going to highlight the materials that most highlight what those themes are that you've examined and seen are persistent across all of those materials. Now, what kinds of research questions are most appropriate in content analysis? You're often going to focus on what are cultural norms? How are groups of people or particular behaviors portrayed in popular society and in popular media? What are the obvious and less obvious subtle cultural messages that are being sent? And how are ideas framed in these kinds of materials? You can also look at a historical event where there are no people to interview, but you can see how the cultural ideas of the time were expressed in popular media of that day, or the effects of the event or time period on people as seen, whether it's in letters or other materials. One of the most powerful things you can see is compare the same or similar cultural artifacts over time, such as looking at advice columns in women's magazines in the 1950s through the 2010s to see what kinds of advice were given and what that may say about the messages given to women at different times. Now, the one thing that's not always great is for understanding how people interpreted the media or pop cultural portrayals, since you're seeing the media analyzing it, but you're not actually talking to how people are actually using that material or consuming it. There's often a disjuncture between how the media says people should act and the reality of how people are actually acting at the time. For example, if you look at movies from the 1930s and 1940s, because there was a Hollywood code that restricted various kinds of sexualization and certain topics, things are not discussed in that media that were still going on in the general public. So if you just use the movies to say what people were actually doing in the 30s or 40s, you might be missing out on quite a bit. So what kinds of research questions are appropriate for content analysis? These are all examples from your book. For example, you could look at how do television game shows reinforce racial stereotypes? Look at how groups of people are portrayed on those television game shows and see what the racial dynamics are through various coding. You could also look at how do newspaper articles about debates over gay marriage reinforce or challenge heteronormativity? How are ideas framed? What words occur most frequently, and so on. You could also look at the discourse in medical textbooks over time for what constitutes a healthy pregnancy and how that changed. For example, comparing textbooks from the 1910s, the 1950s, the 2000s, you could see how those writing the books, assumedly what many doctors were looking at and being trained in, would treat women and what a healthy pregnancy was. What kinds of literature review help do content analysis? First of all, it helps you familiarize yourself with what research that has already been conducted so that you can identify specific themes, images, or just the wording used for when you analyze and how you might measure them in similar ways. You can look for articles on a similar topic, one that's been studied using a different group of materials. People in the past may have looked at a topic and analyzed books or movies, while you want to look at social media. There may use other research in order to get a sense of what were the norms and beliefs of a particular topic and how has that changed over time, especially if you want to look at an older study and see if similar norms are expressed in current media or whether there's been any change. For sampling with content analysis, there's a number of issues that come into play. First of all, you need to choose the whole category of materials that you want to analyze, and then choose a sample. Now, the advantage of content analysis is you usually can have a quite large sample since the cost is usually low. You may even sample the whole body of materials if it's a relatively low amount. We're going to talk in a few minutes about children's books that have won certain awards. You could look, as that example did, all of the books that won the award over 70 years. That gives you a power for when people want to say, well, were you being careful in your analysis? You say, looked at everything. You need to use the knowledge of context, of what was happening within that media production framework, within that area of materials, to choose the right sample, and to choose useful periods over time to compare what samples to use over whether it's that did they exist in the 1910s, 1950s, 2000s, and was it a continuous production? Were the materials produced in similar ways? You want to know that to understand whether the samples are actually comparable. Now, the thing is, if you are using a subsample, much like surveys, you're often going to want to do a random sample so that whatever materials you examine, they're likely to be representative of the broader materials in the whole body of media production that you're looking at. Now, if you are doing a more qualitative approach, you may not do a purely random sample, but you may look for those that are most theoretically interesting, those that seem to be the most popular in a particular period, ones that reflect a particular subculture, but you should always be able to justify your sampling approach based on your research question. What you need to do is set the criteria based on that research question of what content is worth sampling given that research question. Now, we're going to talk about coding with quantitative content analysis, and the codes that matter in such content analysis is, first of all, you start with coding sheets. Coding sheets are tools that help you record the same information for each object you look at, with notes done in a standardized way. It's much like a survey instrument. It guides all data collection, says, if you see X, record it in this way. You want to make sure, first of all, that you record the key title or identification for any items that examine for each item that you are in your category of work that you're looking at. You also want to specify what variables you're going to be analyzing and collecting for each item. This is the way you measure, operationalize the concepts that come from your original research question. And the key question is, how are you measuring each variable for each item in a standardized way so that anybody that's on your research team or is brought in, or people who are reading your results in the end, all agree that this was a reasonable measure for a consistent measure, a reliable measure for seeing was whatever phenomenon you were analyzing, was that there in a persistent way? Now, for qualitative content analysis, the coding is slightly different. You're still using coding sheets to record your observations, but it's more open-ended than quantitative analysis, more like when you did coding for interviews. You look more holistically at the messages and content of the materials. The questions you're asking of the materials may yield a wider range of answers and observations that go beyond any initial hypotheses or hunches you may have had. It may generate new hypotheses, new themes, new correlations you hadn't expected to see. Any questions should ultimately follow your initial research question, but this is ultimately less quote-unquote objective criterion than quantitative coding, since you're more willing to find these new themes, new variables. This is, as we said earlier, a more inductive approach. Now, the ethics of content analysis is far less worrisome than most areas of research, especially if it's publicly available content, no informed consent is needed. With more private materials, things owned by families, estates, things like letters or diaries that may not have previously been published, you may need to get consent from those still living or use pseudonyms. You may need permission from family members to use those materials. Now, as far as preparing for data collection, first, you need to gather all of the materials or the samples of those materials that you need to get, whether purchasing or recording the materials. You're going to have some kind of pre-test encoding sheet, recording the data exactly as you expect to do it for the broader research project sample in order to make sure that whatever coding you're using seems to work and is consistent. You want to train your research team so that all the members are being as consistent as possible in coding in the exact same way. If there's the same materials, they should code them the same way. And then based on that, you write a code book to document the variables to be used, and if you're going to be doing statistical analysis, any numeric codes that can be then feed the results into statistical software at the end. Now, the actual data collection, you're going to use the procedures so far developed to code the full sample that you may have collected. This is the time-consuming part. You may be going through a vast set of materials over time. Having a research team that can continue to meet, to discuss, to monitor what's known as intercoder reliability, i.e., are they being consistent? Are they all coding the same things in the same way? And discuss any difficulties in coding or new situations that wasn't found during the pre-testing phase. Now, for quantitative data analysis, you're going to then transfer data from whatever coding sheets you've developed and input it into statistical software. You want to clean any data to ensure there's no missing data, that everything's been correctly entered. And then you'll run frequencies for most common observations for each variable. And then, most common with this kind of quantitative analysis, look for correlations between variables. For more written variables, you can conduct word counts on particular words and their context, and looking at the words around them to see, is there things statistically that show how meaning was used and how it emerges in the frequency of words used and the correlation between words to other words within the text. Now, for qualitative data analysis, you're going to combine data from data analysis using some software where you develop code as you enter the data. Look for the patterns in the data. Look for negative cases for those patterns you have identified to ensure you aren't ignoring data that contradicts your observed patterns. And then write memos to document any additional thoughts, ideas, or any questions that you've generated that help you look for new themes and new ideas that come out of that qualitative data. Now, when you're doing coding, what kinds of patterns may you look for? As noted, you may look for frequency, how often something occurs across objects or within a single object. You also may be interested in magnitude, how profoundly something occurs. Even if it occurs rarely, when it happens, is the expression, the views of it within the media emphasized? What types of media when materials show up? Are there subgroups of something that occur when there are other objects of a similar nature? What is the process, the stages when objects move from point A to point B? And what are the essential parts that go into making up a phenomena? That when you see media created, what are the parts that seem most common, especially if you're trying to understand, for example, what goes into gender recreation and gender roles? What are the beliefs, actions, and responses that you observe in the media? Now, once you get those results, how are you going to evaluate them and present them? The first thing you want to do is do another check for intercoder reliability. One thing you can do, if you're doing more quantitative analysis, is the software can look for consistency amongst coders. You can also check for the validity of coding matching the concepts of the original research question. This isn't just, was there consistency, but was what you were looking for, did it really represent the concepts you were originally interested in? I.e., is it related to anything that's actually real? Now, you also want to use examples from the materials, the things that seem to demonstrate exactly what was happening, what are the relationships that you want to discuss. Like, what are the exemplars? That can be like vivid examples to reinforce whatever overall patterns you're going to discuss in your write-up. And in that write-up, you want to explain all of the research steps, the decisions made, whether in sampling, coding, and any description of the final sample you did. And then you describe major findings, relationships among the variables, and any themes that emerged. This week I had you read an article, Representations of Material, Culture, and Gender in Award-Winning Children's Books, a 20-year follow-up. This being a follow-up to another study is actually of great interest here. Here's the summary from the piece. The study tested a hypothesis that children's books should accurately reflect gender-based divisions of labor in the overall culture and the historical period in which they were published. The content analysis of this study was performed on illustrations in books that won what was called the Caldecott Medal or Honor between 1990 and 2009, a 20-year period. The final sample within all those books, they had 490 illustrations, since they're interested in the art primarily, that existed in 68 of the books that had some kind of art out of the 85 books that won the award. What they were interested in was the character gender and the type of material artifacts they were using, divided in this study between household and production artifacts, coded by gender in that sense. What they found was that the larger proportion of female characters in the books were using household artifacts, whereas the larger proportion of male characters used production artifacts outside the home, still seeming to reinforce gender roles in these award-winning books. Now, the authors discuss the relationship of these representations to the real world of gender, tools, and work, noting that women had increasingly joined the workforce, yet that didn't seem to be being reflected in the children's books being read. And they discuss, what does this mean for the socialization of children? Now, here's the key part of their literature review. They first of all cited to theoretical work on gender roles, how material culture reflects and promotes those roles. But here's the interesting part. There had been an older study looking at the same kind of award-winning children's books that had spanned from 1938 to 1989 that looked as well at how gender was reflected in the use of household artifacts and pictures within those books. They also looked at another study that looked at more popular, non-award-winning illustrated children's books from 1963 to 1995. What they found were the studies had found generally that despite changes in gender roles over earlier decades, the pictures within children's books continue to maintain a gendered depictions of roles. They, again, used economic analysis to note the continual changes of roles of women increasingly in the workforce and doing outside work, yet this wasn't being reflected in the children's books. So their interest is, since women do more housework, they thought that finally, in the last 20 years, women would be associated with more household artifacts than men, that the proportion of women characters using household artifacts probably wouldn't change because women were still doing most housework even as they went out into the workplace, but that the proportion of women characters using production artifacts would increase over time. Those were their hypotheses. Now here's how they did the coding and data collection. They had a whole team of coders. They used a coding system from the earlier studies so that their study would be an exact follow-up to that. Each picture was coded for 2 variables, the gender of the character, the artifact in the picture, household or production, meaning like housework or some kind of professional like tool. As noted, the final sample had 490 illustrations over 68 award-winning books. And they did find that the intercoder agreement was high. Everybody seemed to code the same way. So what were the results? Female characters were more likely to be shown using household artifacts, bowls, knives, spoons, sewing machines, than male characters were. There was no significant difference detected between the 1990s and the 2000s. Males were more likely than females to be shown using production artifacts, cars, trucks, fishing nets, tools. And contrary to expectations, the illustrations of female characters using production artifacts did not change significantly over the 2 decades. The illustrations showing male characters using production artifacts did not significantly decrease between the 1990s and 2000s. This is the overall graphs, and you see some slight tiny changes, but within the margin of error. So this is remarkably consistent. So what are the conclusions and the discussions from this? While the books accurately reflected that women were more involved in housework, that's been persistent even as women have gone into the workforce, it failed to reflect women's growing role in the workplace and failed to capture the decline of men in the workforce. Combined with the earlier studies, the picture that emerges is that the representation of such activities in these children's books remained stable for more than 70 years. Even as the world of gender and women in the workplace dramatically changed, children's books did not. This seems to challenge an idea that some had promoted earlier, that there was merely a cultural lag. That, yeah, children's books were still very traditional, but that would change over time. It still hadn't changed. Instead, what you see is that associations between gender and objects are persistent and are promoting ideas and cultural norms that are, in fact, at variance with the reality of their society. The one caveat that the authors did do, always trying to understand to explain, since if you have negative cases that go against your hypotheses, it's worth trying to look for a more benign explanation. Many of the books do, especially award-winning books, did reflect some non-US and historical places which would have reflected overseas or past gendered situations. Still, that wasn't quite enough. And they did come to the conclusion, as their summary goes, the authors say, we are suggesting that sources of socialization, such as children's books that point girls in one direction and boys in another, ultimately can constrain children's and later adults' development of interests and opportunities with respect to material culture. That this persistence reflects a cultural message, not just a reflection of the culture in place.